In this final session, we'll review how to approach answering 5 frequently asked genealogy questions from patrons. Our instructors for this session are Ann Lawthers and Alice Kane. Both assist patrons at our reference desks during one-on-one consultations and through several online reference services such as chat, email, and phone. We'll hear from both during the session on these frequently asked about topics, and we'll start with Alice Kane.
Welcome back, and starting us off in this session's roadmap is one of the frequent questions we encounter from our library visitors. I took a DNA test, and how do I find my ancestors with results? This is a very complex topic on its own, so bear with us as we try to touch on some DNA basics that you've heard from Anne, as well as some things to look for and explain to your patrons to help them understand the results more before they start researching an answer to their question. In addition to our online subject guide to begin with, one of the best approachable resources out there is the Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy, authored by Blaine Bettinger. So what are the reasons for testing? In many cases, it begins as a fun activity within the family or among friends to find out what their origins are through DNA. And for others, DNA is the tool to use to look for or confirm a connection. You'll notice that applying to a lineage society and adoption are the most common reasons for using DNA to look for and confirming connections, one in which a specific individual is not known and one where a connection is suspected or proposed. This leads us to a quick review of the types of tests that are available. Autosomal, also known as ATDNA, tests are the most commonly offered for genealogy and are the least expensive, ranging anywhere between $50 to $90, depending on occasional discounts that occur. Autosomal testing reports on a person's racial and ethnic background, revealing DNA characteristics that are from the tester, inheriting genes from their mom and their father. Y-DNA testing reports on genetic characteristics of the Y sex chromosome found only in males. These characteristics are passed from father to son mostly unchanged, and so makes this testing useful for confirming direct male line. Having a match in this test definitely means that they're related, and Y-DNA tests are the most expensive tests available, ranging $120 to $450, depending on the number of strand areas or markers on the chromosome that are being tested. All cells in the human body contain mitochondria, and its characteristics are passed by a mother to all of her children, both genders, but it's her daughters who can actually pass the DNA on to future generation. That makes mitochondrial or mtDNA testing useful in confirming a family's female lineage. To be clear, though, a single DNA test cannot immediately answer any one question. Testing is more likely to create even more questions for the tester about his family history. And it's the analysis of a number of different test results together that will help create a genetic picture of the family to use and compare with matching results of other testers. When looking at test results, the main thing to look for in anyone's test is the haplogroup number. These are very unique to each individual and defines the originating geographic area that a person's most distant ancestor comes from. And then the other item to be looking at is genetic distance identified between the two matching testers. Some companies specialize in pinpointing geographies genetically and can propose a specific detail about a tester's origins, such as a particular African tribe or an area of Ireland. In a quick look, Genetic distances define how close the relationship is between the two testers with the matching results, and it's an estimated number of generations between them and their common ancestor. The lower the number, the closer the relationship is, which can then be verified using traditional records research to determine that. Pictured here is a graphical representation of a DNA test, one for paternity. This case was discussed in the website DNAexplained.com. The three colors represent DNA samples from a child, the mother, and the father. And you can see the different matching elements between the child's DNA and that of their parents that confirm the relationship. These charts give a quick explanation of relationships displayed by the results of each specific tests. Genetic distance numbers are interpreted a little differently for each type of tests. In Y-DNA, the numerical values imply broad relationship ranges, whereas mtDNA or mitochondrial DNA values indicate a common ancestor between two testers that are within a range of anywhere between 5 to 22 generations, or up to a total of 550 years between them. And in autosomal testing, they don't really use a genetic distance, but it's the counting of shared centimorgan numbers that tell you if one is related or not. And the closeness is determined on matching the highest number of strands that are of the same lengths. The lower the number, the closer the relationship, as I mentioned before, which then can be verified with records research. Genetic distances over 3 in Y-DNA testing involve way too many matching individuals and their different combinations of DNA results that for previous generations that it's not as effective to be used for tracing matches. Traditional paper trail research is best for any results beyond the genetic distance of 3 for Y-DNA testing. Putting those charts to use, here's a sample autosomal result from our subject guide, DNA and Genealogy. The relationship range displays a friendly description of the potential relationships with the tester's DNA match. The number of the matching tester's shared centimorgan column will tell you how to prioritize investigating their uploaded tree if that's available, and possibly contacting the tester. The higher number of shared centimorgans, the more likely there is a definite relationship. Just like the image a couple of slides ago, most companies do offer a graphical view of the DNA areas of both testers for minute centimorgan by centimorgan comparison. Next is a mitochondrial DNA match list organized in the leftmost column by the tester's genetic distance from their respective matching testers. Of this listing, you'll see the names of the earliest known ancestors for each of the matching testers, and this information is only known if the user has posted information to their online tree. The testing company's software will make that calculation for you and bring up the names of the individuals that would fit the profile of the matches. For this particular tester, they should try contacting and reviewing more earnestly the top 2 matches. And last is this Y-DNA test, organized again by genetic distance of the testing of the matching tester. You'll see that the matching testers completed tests ranging in different sizes of markers examined. There's a 67 here, and then this one's a 111. The top matches are pulled from the common strands that are shared between them, regardless of the size of the actual size of the markers, besides the number of markers tested. The earliest ancestor named ties the column in with the tester's uploaded family information. So if there's no family tree information available, then there is no name supplied in the earliest known ancestor column. Methodical review of a tester's match result will hopefully answer their question of how they're connected. Triangulation looks at DNA results of two or more testers and their family trees as part of a two-step process. First is segment triangulation, which looks at where on a person's DNA strand the matching pieces or segments are found when compared to that of another tester segment. We want to find matching segments in the same part of the DNA strand. This is why having more family members tested is helpful for this triangulation, because there will be DNA segments that are found in the father's side of the family and not on the mother's, and then there's also the reverse. Tree triangulation comes after you've narrowed down the matching results from the segment examination to the testers with the most matching segments. Depending on how these triangulation studies go, a matching tester and their family will be included or excluded from your consideration. There are many sources for help. Some testers have found the information pages or agents from the testing companies helpful. In other cases, DNA-oriented forums and communities are offered by the testing companies, as well as many found on Facebook and on Twitter. These can help provide quick information and help, but definitely not recommended for complex projects. Books by and consultations with experienced genealogists can help with very specific relationship questions and should be considered after reviewing known information and consulting with other persons. There are specialized DNA testing projects focused on one family surnames or geographic group. Most of these are Y-DNA oriented. Visit the Guild of One Name Studies or your particular family association to find one of these DNA projects to join or to get more information about. And for those who enjoy a challenge, the website of the International Society of Genetic Genealogy is chock full of descriptions and very technical explanations of DNA, of genetic genealogy, but is not for the technically faint of heart. And now we have Anne.
Thank you, Alice. I'm going to talk about the topic of my family lore says I have Mayflower ancestry. Is that true? Frequently at the American Ancestors Library on Newbury Street in Boston, we get patrons who are interested in proving their lineage and connection to the Mayflower, or perhaps the DAR, the SAR, or the colonial dames. You engage in conversation, but after a few questions, we discover that the patron only knows their family history back to their great-grandmother, and that they are relying on family lore to say that they have a Mayflower connection. A few more questions later, and we discover that the patron's knowledge of her great-grandmother is rather limited. It is limited to a state and the fact that the birth date was approximately the 20th century. So, what next for you as the reference librarian? This is a perfect opportunity to engage in a little patron education, such as work from the known to the unknown, and that starting the other way around is virtually impossible. There are approximately 10 million Americans, give or take a few, that are descended from the original Mayflower passengers. That's a lot of opportunity for making a big mistake. The Mayflower Silver Books, which are the Bible accepted by the General Mayflower Society, cover 5 or 6 generations from the immigrant, which takes you up to about the late 18th or early 19th century. So if the grandmother was born, let's say about 1900, that still leaves 3 or 4 generations in the middle that you need to identify. What we recommend is that the patron start with some of the basic tools with the pedigree chart and fill it out as far back as possible. Then, working from the 5th generation forward, 5th generation in relation to the person asking the question, you can eliminate lines where the ancestor is the immigrant. This then leaves you with a focus on those lines that extend back to the Revolutionary War or perhaps even earlier. A question for the patron might be, do you have DAR or SAR membership? Then you begin to identify the names, birth dates, and birthplaces for persons born in the last half of the 18th century. Here is an example of how you might use a pedigree chart with your patron. This actually is me. I'm over here as number 1, and these are my family lineages. I go out to the 5th generation with 16 great-great-grandparents, second great-grandparents. What I've done here on this chart is I've crossed off all of those who were who were born in another country. So this eliminates, a good half of the 5th generation lines, but it does leave some of the 5th generation lines. Upon further research, I discovered that actually the only line that's going to go far enough back is the Emma Hall Curtis line. The others end in German immigrants or Irish immigrants. Now, if the patron is able to get their ancestry of the 1700s into southeastern Massachusetts, they may have a pretty good chance at finding Mayflower ancestors because the descendants of the Pilgrims did not leave southeastern Massachusetts all that rapidly. So sometimes geography can help you determine how likely it is that you have a Mayflower ancestor. Also remembers that the Pilgrims were intolerant of any religious differences. So if your ancestor was a Quaker or a Baptist, they probably didn't descend from a Pilgrim. Now, if you are looking to help patron apply to a lineage society, keep in mind that lineage societies are very interested in the documentation of all vital events, that is the births, the marriages, and the deaths, not only for the direct descendant, but the spouse. The preferred documentation is a birth registration or a baptismal record from a church, perhaps a marriage record or and a marriage record and a death record, although cemetery stones with full dates can be used. Compiled genealogies without citations are not acceptable. County histories also are not acceptable. So you would use these last two sources as finding aids. If the compiled genealogy suggests that there is a certain link, that will tell you where to go at what time period to look for a record. The county history, as was mentioned in an earlier session, can help you identify what the earliest churches were in an area as a finding aid to help you locate the records you need for proof. Now let's take a look at a potential Mayflower line that actually has a documentation problem. You don't know this until you begin to look at the connections between each of the people on the tree. Edward Fuller is the Mayflower passenger. His son, Samuel Fuller, and for 5 generations, the linkages are fully documented in the Mayflower Silver Books. So all well and good up to Amos Chamberlain of Vermont. Amos Chamberlain had a son, Amos, in 1770. Fortunately, this birth was well documented. The Vermont vital records do have documentation of that birth. The Vermont vital records also have documentation of an Anne Chamberlain being born in 1793. The records do not mention her middle name. The owner of this particular tree had hypothesized that her middle name was going to be Alger because her mother's maiden name was Alger. Now, this Anne ended up marrying a Samuel Williams, or Anne Chamberlain ended up marrying a Samuel Williams of New Jersey. The problem here is that with Anne being born in 1793 and getting married in 1809, she would have been underage at the time of her marriage in New Jersey. That is, if the Anne Chamberlain who married Samuel Williams is the same Anne Chamberlain who was the daughter of Amos Chamberlain. So here we have a situation where all the available documentation suggests that Amos and his wife Anna, yes, they did have a daughter Anne, but they went nowhere near New Jersey, nor did any of Amos's male children go to New Jersey. In fact, Amos and his sons went west. They went to New York State and then to Illinois. Thus, there really is nothing to link the Anne Chamberlain who married Samuel Williams of New Jersey with the Amos Chamberlain who went west. And finally, the migration pattern of Vermont to New Jersey would be highly unusual. So looking at the documentation becomes critical when applying to a lineage society. The patron whose tree this was had been seduced by the little waving leaves and attached the wrong Anne Chamberlain to her tree. So beware of those shaking leaves. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Alice.
Thank you. And we're going to fast forward to the 20th century, where many of our library visitors interested in family history are younger than the stereotypical grandmotherly genealogist that one would picture. Many of our visitors would range in age from children to adults in their 30s and 40s, and the question they might pose would be, my ancestors came during the 20th century. How do I find information about them? For people arriving during the 20th century, there are two distinct groups. The latest group of modern immigrants are those born after the mid-1900s and arriving to the United States anywhere between 1951 and the year 2000. Descendants of this group will have the most research challenges because of modern privacy laws and the fact that in this century, being from different countries are not only a physical but also jurisdictional impediment to doing effective genealogical research. For the latter 20th century, again, U.S. privacy laws and the laws of other countries will restrict access to vital and other records, but happily, database websites such as Ancestry, Fold3, and Family Search have arranged access to many useful records that are generated in the late 20th century. Local city directories, voter registration, newspaper articles, and obituaries are the most commonly available resources to obtain more information about these immigrants. Local city directories are published by various publishing companies who are independent of government, so they send their own canvassers out to gather information independent of government sources. And their publications are usually a year's delayed, so a city directory for a particular year will probably include data that is valid from the previous year. Voter registration, for all intent and purposes, are public records, and one can apply to the town clerk to review any historical records if those still exist. Be aware that some jurisdictions will have a schedule of destruction so that after a certain amount of time, some of those records are destroyed. In other cases, happily, all those records are kept and hopefully will be useful to you. Newspaper articles and obituaries offer the researcher confirmation of various stories and reports of facts. Don't forget that in this day and age, social media can connect people who have information. Some outside of the box sources for personal information could also be professional or academic directories or periodicals. Labor and fraternal organizations and their periodicals are another group to seek out if your family member participated. And again, for social media, the internet and social media can connect people with others who have information. To check on a known living person, many countries have some form of white pages for lookups, so you can check online, but do be cautious when actually making contacts. Searching family names as well as these keywords to find groups in Facebook and Twitter can net you various groups to whose individuals can provide you with information. In Twitter, searching with the hashtag will actually find you real conversations from people with potential information for you. Check with your patron about the occupation of their family member. Some sources of personal information can be found in professional and academic directories, sometimes going online and looking at people's current CVs can give you some clues as to their family connections. Local labor and fraternal organizations and their periodicals are another group to seek if a family member participated. Finally, our last record group of 20th century immigrants, our last record group for 20th century immigrants is naturalization records. Naturalization papers dated to the 1960s may be available from the National Archives record centers serving the respective state in which a foreign-born person was naturalized. Ancestry, Fold 3, and Family Search are destinations for digitized versions of these that have been released. More recent naturalization records later than the 1960s are held by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. Their website can provide information and online forms for requesting copies of historical documents for genealogy. In particular, are forms G1041, which requests a search of historical indexes for the names of your family members, and Form G1041A, which is the formal request for the actual documents found in the indexes during the 1041 index search. Unhappily, wait times and the costs can be a bit long and high for these types of searches. Ordering naturalization and A-file papers can be done at the USCIS website. From the main page, drop down the Tools menu and select Research My Family's Immigration History under the Research Tools category. The USCIS Genealogy Program offers access to historical immigration and naturalization records. Alien registration, or AR files, documented immigrants age 14 or older entering and residing in the U.S. between 1940 and 1944. Following that period and up to 1951, alien or A files succeeded the AR group in documenting immigrants to the United States. These profiles contain interviews and other collected information for each individual entering the country. Naturalization certificates on file cover the time range of 1906 to 1956, and an overview of the records requests with and without the case numbers. For records filed after 1951 for immigration and for after 1956 for naturalization, the USCIS offers a different program. To get the immigration records of a family member or your own record, a request is made under the Freedom of Information Act. A personal account for this program will be required on this website. Information and instructions for requesting such records can be found on this page. Our last group of early 20th century immigrants, those born in the late 1800s and early 1900s and arriving to the United States between 1900 and 1950. For the early 20th century, information can be gleaned from the same source list as the late 20th century immigrants, with two additions: censuses and passenger lists. Censuses in between 1900 and the latest available census year of 1940 record the immigration and or naturalization years of each responder of the census. When looking at census notations, be sure to look for abbreviations as to citizenship status. The notation NA means that the person is naturalized, and one can look for a naturalization at some point before that current census year. The notation AL means alien, and that the person has not applied for naturalization at all. PA notation means that a petition is applied for, and that sometime within 5 years of that census year, you would expect to find a naturalization decree at a court near that person. The naturalizations will show places of origin recorded, but as you step backwards in time, some of the naturalization records will not collect as many bits of information as previously. Naturalizations would be applied for more by males, and very few females applied in their own name until after the 19th Amendment in 1920. Women derived their citizenship from the citizenship status of their husbands, and if they married a foreign-born man before he becomes naturalized, a woman actually lost her citizenship and needed to repatriate later when laws changed. Passenger lists will also have quite a bit of detail for persons arriving in the U.S. and will include such questions as listing the name and location of a family member in the country that they came from, as well as the name and address of the person to which they were going to. Be sure to check passenger lists for a second page. Oftentimes, the index searching that brings you to a passenger list page brings you just to the first one, and there may be additional information on the following image for that person. And now, passing back to Anne, who can provide more information.
Thank you, Alice. I'm going to pick up where Alice has just left off, and I am going to show you how you might respond to a patron who comes and says, "How do I find where my immigrant ancestor came from?" So patrons frequently come to the library and say, "I'd like to find out where in Ireland my ancestor came from," or "where in Germany or Sweden." Typically, these patrons have done a fair amount of research and have recently discovered their immigrant ancestor and are ready to jump across the pond, or so they think. What we recommend is that the clues about ancestral origin really lie in the records on this side of the ocean. So first, the patron needs to learn as much about the immigrant as they possibly can. That includes their name with spelling variations. No, the name was not changed at Ellis Island, but sometimes over years of living in America, an immigrant may change either their surname or the way that they spell it. You also need to understand who the siblings of the immigrant are. Often people focus only on their direct lineage or the spouses and children of their direct lineage, when in fact the siblings are very important to identify when you are trying to place your ancestor on the other side of the ocean. You need to know siblings because everyone in the country of origin has the same name, as you will discover, and you will need to distinguish your John Murphy from all the other John Murphys. Also, you need to consider where your ancestors' neighbors came from. People rarely migrated alone, although there is a time period around 1900 when a number of single people came on ships. But in those cases, those people were often practicing what is known as chain migration. So one person comes first, a few years later, someone else comes. It might be members of the same family, or it might be the neighbors. So where did your ancestors' neighbors come from? What specific location? we often discover that our own ancestors don't leave the record we need, but we might find something among the neighbors. Now, once you know the name of the country, you need to learn as much about the country at the time of emigration. This is particularly important for what is now Germany and also for Eastern Europe, because borders changed with regularity in the late 1800s up through World War II. So how do you find your ancestors' place of origin? As Alice mentioned, the U.S. federal census, particularly from 1880 onward, is extremely helpful. Naturalization papers and passenger lists, and I will show you some examples. Less well-known finding aids include probate or death registers, also draft registration cards, who would have known, and of course, obituaries. You've seen this example before, but I am showing it again to highlight the fact that the censuses include the place of birth, not only for the person listed on the census line. So here we have James Crotty lists his birthplace as Ireland, but it also lists his parents' places as Ireland. So when you are looking to try to have a clue as to where the person came from, do check 1880 censuses and laters for not only the householder, but also information about their parents. Sometimes you will find a census that includes a county or a province within a foreign country, not just the country. These are gold. Unfortunately, they're somewhat rare. The 20th century naturalization record is also an excellent place to get beyond just the country name and identify a county or province, or even better, a town. This record shows specific towns in Finland where Armamaki came from. So it is a very valuable finding aid. Early naturalization records tend to only list the country, but sometimes they will also list the county, such as Cork, Ireland. New York arrival lists may also include exactly the level of detail that you need. This is an arrival list for the ship Rhineland, arriving on the 23rd of February, 1888. And the person of interest here is Lieb Freundlich. He's age 22, and he's a tailor. The nice thing about this record is it says he's from Bucsac in Austria-Hungarian Empire at the time, but now that place is in Ukraine. When you find a notation such as this, your first instinct is going to be to go to Google Maps and see if you can find Bucsac, and it will be very difficult. When you are dealing with unfamiliar names, you may need to consult a gazetteer, such as the online Jewish Gen Community Database, or other finding aids for Eastern European towns and their name changes. Joseph Masder was also an Eastern European immigrant. Now, his World War II draft registration card gives his place of origin as Lystrachi Grodno in Poland. But if you look at his birth date, it was 1884. Poland ceased to exist for over 100 years after being partitioned in the 1790s. So at the time that Joseph Mazda was born, the town, Lysychansk, was under Russian governance. This is another example where you will need to use a gazetteer in addition to Google Maps to actually locate the origin for an ancestor. And finally, you can consult obituaries. This is a very early list of deaths. It is from a cholera epidemic in 1854 in New York City. It identifies where people were from in very broad ways. Here we have someone who actually died of consumption. He was a native of Ireland, aged 25 years. So these particular deaths do help you understand where someone might have come from. Here's another consumption death. John Tierney, a native of Ireland. Doesn't tell you where in Ireland, but at least it gives you the country. So these are some clues about how to identify and direct your patron to clues and strategies for finding their ancestor before trying to find them in the country of origin. And now our final topic. You may have patrons who come in desirous of tracing their African American history, family history. Now, there are a number of challenges to researching African American lines. It often requires creative searching methods. So if you are working with a patron who wants to search their African American roots, you need to manage their expectations. Many African Americans find it difficult to trace their family earlier than the 1870 census because this is the first federal census following emancipation and the first to record many slaves by name. If your ancestor was free before 1865, you may find them, in fact, you probably will find them in the U.S. federal census. But if your ancestor was a former slave, the records prior to both the Emancipation Proclamation and the constitutional amendment that abolished slavery would be under the slave owner's name. And unfortunately, determining a slave owner's name is not at all straightforward. Even professional genealogists who specialize in African American research find it hard to identify a potential slave owner of an emancipated slave. Their success rate is only about 50%. Conventional wisdom for years has said that newly emancipated slaves took the names of their slave owners. However, that is not necessarily the case. When looking for a potential slave owner, do start with geography and start with the 1870 census. Where was the ancestor living in 1870? What town and what county? Then go through page by page, and some researchers recommend going 10 pages forward and 10 pages back to identify all property owners listed on the census in 1870 before and after your ancestor. You may need to consult not only the 1850 and 1860 U.S. federal census, the slave schedules, which give only gender and ages, but you may also need to look at land records for the town. As I mentioned, the surnames of slave owners sometimes can give you clues. but only about 15% of former slaves took their slave owner's last surname. They may have taken the surname of a different slave owner, either the first, the favorite, or whomever they were with longest. Or they may even have a surname passed down to them by parents and grandparents. The more you understand the identity of a person, the better your chances of tracing them. Components of identity include name, age, spouse, children, and siblings. Here you are looking to establish the family circle and the age relationships among the family members so that when you find a possible record, you can evaluate how likely it is to be for your ancestor. As I mentioned in conjunction with the last slide, start with the location and the family member. Try looking for your 1870s ancestor's death record. Then try finding their marriage record. And only lastly, look for the birth record. This is because the more recent the record, the more likely it is to include kinship information. So a death record, particularly if your ancestor lived into the 20th century, may give the very valuable information as to who the parents were. Marriage records after 1870 might very well include information about the parent. Birth record, if it's close to 1870, may also include the parents' names, but your best bet is going to be looking for the ancestor's death record. Do keep in mind that a family may have adopted several different surnames before settling on the one that is passed down into the 20th and later centuries. Here we have Alan Blevins, listed in Morgan County, Alabama on the 1870 census, who is listed as Alan Reeves in 1880 in Morgan County, Alabama, and in subsequent U.S. federal censuses. So he apparently tried on the surname Blevins for a while. It didn't work for him and his family, and he switched to Reeves. Other sources of information about African American families before the Civil War might be the manumissions and indentures records from 1780 to 1840. These are arranged by the name of a slave holder or the master in the case of an indenture. And you will find a listing for these in your handout. The census record that you see here is from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and it's the 1850 census. Turns out that Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and you have several pages of Black families listed here, and their place of birth is all given as Pennsylvania. But in point of fact, none of these individuals were born in Pennsylvania. They are newly freed slaves or escaped slaves. So do also check earlier censuses. For post-war, post-Civil War searching, you have several very good options. The first is the Freedmen's Saving and Trust. This bank was in operation from 1865 to 1874, and the records include extensive demographic information about a family. The early books even give the name of the former master or mistress and the name of the plantation. So if you find an ancestor in the Freedmen's Savings and Trust records, you may have found a bonanza. Another type of document which Alice touched upon are the voter registration lists. Now, some states held voter registration drives quite soon after the Civil War. Others did not. On the next page, we see an example of a voter registration list from Texas of 1867 to 1869. It lists the date the person was registered, gives their place of reference, and how long they were in the state, in that particular county, and in the precinct. And it also gives the race. Places like Texas had, or rather a number of communities in Texas, had registration fairly soon after the end of the Civil War. Places like Morgan County, Alabama also had registration soon after the Civil War. Others waited until the 70s to conduct extensive voter registration. Now let's take a look at the very rich records that you find from the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Bureau is not the same as the Savings and Trust Company, so don't confuse the two. One was a bank. The Bureau was a governmental organization established to supervise relief efforts after the war. One of the very important functions that they did was to register marriages for the newly emancipated slaves. Many slaves may have been married in a personal service, but their marriage registration had not been recorded. After the war, these marriages were recognized by the government. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped people through food and clothing and promoting education. The Bureau witnessed labor contracts between the freedmen and the plantation owners. They also worked to help freedmen settle on abandoned or confiscated land. So the records of the Freedmen's Bureau can be quite rich. The field office records are going to be the most detailed, and they are organized roughly by county. Also, many of these records are not indexed, so it would require going through the records page by page, which can be daunting to someone who's not used to doing it. But on the other hand, reading through these records is quite an eye-opening experience. In summary then, when you are working with a patron, to answer the questions that you hear most often about genealogy, do rely on the tools and techniques that you have learned about during this seminar. Especially start with what you know and work backwards. Resist the temptation to skip generations. Help the patron use the standard forms, especially the pedigree chart. Remember the Family Search Research Wiki. It's a wonderful source about places that you may have no knowledge of, but someone at the Family Search and the Family History Library has written a wonderful article explaining all the records with record losses, record dates, etc. Then consider censuses, passenger lists, naturalization records, in addition to vital records, as some of the key sources for genealogical research. Every encounter that you have with a patron is an opportunity for new learning, not only for them, but for you as well. Thank you very much for listening in to this 5-part series on genealogical tools and techniques for librarians and archivists. I'd like to direct you to the AmericanAncestors.org webpage, especially the Education tab, for more information about our offerings for personal education, for our subject guides, and for templates that you may download for your research. Again, thank you for your time and for participating in this online conference.